Welcome to another edition of Who's Better Baseball, the podcast where we answer a simple question on each show. Who's better at baseball? I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein, managing editor at justbaseball.com. I have Harrison Bruns with us today, and we're going to resume a conversation you and me have had on this show all year, it feels like, and articles you've written all year, the Orioles pitching staff, and wondering when they would find an ace. And now they might have two, as you discussed in your article here, but we're going to focus on the big name, which was, one of the top prospects in baseball who seems to finally have found his stuff at the MLB level, Grayson Rodriguez. You wrote the article yesterday, and we were talking when we were going to do this, and I said, well, if G-Rod carves tonight, we're going to record in the morning, and G-Rod carved. What did you see specifically last night as he just continued this hot stretch he's been on?
Well, as you know, I stay busy at work. So I had a golf tournament last night. So I did not get home till late. And so I did not get to catch the game last night specifically. But it looked like, like looking at like the game log and like checking some of like the highlights, it looked a lot of like the same of a lot of what we've seen since he came back up, right? He didn't walk anybody, right? One walk, one hit, no runs and 6 Ks. And so he was able to pitch through the sixth, right? So he gets through six, which was a struggle when he first was up. Like in his first stint, right? He was struggling to get through like 5 innings because he'd run his pitch count up so high. And so it's been nice to see him work through six, right? He's only had 3 starts since he came back up where he hasn't gotten through six. And so that's been really, really encouraging. And another thing that I've seen with him recently is a lot more confidence with his fastball than he had prior to being sent back down to Norfolk and then coming back up, right? It seemed like he didn't trust it, and it was lacking in command a little bit, right? It was leaving it over the plate. It was getting hit really hard. It felt like he'd get into like 0-2 counts, and then he was scared to throw the fastball. and so that definitely hurt him a lot. But yeah, no, he pitched excellent last night.
And fastball command is the biggest thing for a starting pitcher, right? If you don't have it, and either if you can't locate the zone, you're walking batters, or worse, as you said, if you're leaving it over the heart of the plate and it's getting hit, you don't stand a chance. And so to see G-Rod tap into what we always knew he had, which is a really good fastball, and to be able to finally have confidence with the pitch at this level, I think that might have been the big thing too. It's just, knowing that your best fastball against the best competition on the planet can get the job done. And he's proven that. You also in the article touched on a change in arsenal, how he abandoned one of his pitches and now focused on throwing his better pitches, which is a crazy idea, right? Throw your better pitches and good things happen. Talk to me a little bit about that change in arsenal.
Yeah, I feel like that gets talked about a lot, right? You listen to a baseball podcast and they're talking about like starting pitchers having struggles, and then all of a sudden they figure it out, and it's like, what changed? And it's like, oh well, they eliminated this pitch and started throwing this pitch more. And so I feel like that gets talked about a lot, right? So he, I think before he got sent down was throwing his cutter like over 12% of the time, somewhere between 12 and 13% of the time. Now, since he's come back up, he's throwing it 1.5% of the time, and he's only actually thrown the pitch in 4 games, including last night. He threw it last night, only a couple times. I think he probably threw it 3 times last night. And so, like I said, he's only thrown that pitch in 4 games since being called back up. And you cut 12% off of a pitch, you can add that 12% in elsewhere. And so that's been added to him throwing his slider and changeup, which have been his 2 best pitches all year, right? Before he went down and after he's come back up, those have still been his best 2 pitches, are his slider and changeup. And I feel like Aram, when he talks about Grayson, right, he talks a lot about how good his changeup is. And that's what makes him made him one of the best pitching prospects in baseball, is the fact that he had such a good changeup in the minors. And so that we've seen that jump, right? Like he's throwing the changeup now 25% of the time, and he's throwing his slider now over 17% of the time, right? And that's so both of those pitches have seen I think it's right around like a 4% increase or so, which doesn't seem like a lot, but the main point is he's eliminated that cutter, which was, I think I noted in the article it had before in like his first stint in the majors this year, it had a 52% hard hit rate, right? Like if you're throwing that pitch and it's getting hit hard every other time you throw it, I got to stop throwing it. Like yeah. it's not, even if you are only throwing it 12% of the time, that it just isn't sustainable to have a pitch that's getting hit that hard, that consistently. And so, and as of right now, it looks like he doesn't need the cutter and he's fine with his 4 other pitches, right? If he just leans on the fastball, the slider, and the changeup, and then sprinkles in the curveball, 5 to 6% of the time, like he has been, that seems like it does the trick, right? It doesn't look like he needs that 5th pitch with the cutter. And so he hasn't seen any, detrimental effects by eliminating it. It hasn't, led to another pitch getting hit really hard. It's, just made him a better pitcher overall by just eliminating that pitch.
And I think if you really focus on what he's throwing and go back to that renewed confidence in the fastball, it's about changing those speeds. And sometimes it is good for some pitchers to have a second hard offering. And that's where guys with a good cutter, can find success. But I think it's, more when you have a guy like Corbin Burns, where it's really just the cutter that's awesome. And then, sometimes he'll mix in, that straight fastball. But I feel like if your bread and butter is still that fastball, to be able to throw all of these pitches where you change the speeds and really change them drastically with the changeup, the occasional curve with a slider, it's going to make that fastball stand out more. And so now you're seeing G-Rod look like the guy that we thought coming into the season. That's the crazy thing is, we go back to the offseason and the Orioles, they get Kyle Gibson, but they don't really get that frontline starter that I think everyone was hoping they would coming off last year being so promising. But we all thought, okay, G-Rod's their ace, which was a lot to put on a kid that still had never done it. And then we saw the fault of that early on this year when it didn't work out. Now G-Rod's looking more and more like a guy you can count on. And so as we're, looking at the outlook of their playoff rotation, that's going to weigh very, very large in how they're able to make a run this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I've talked about it in other episodes that we've done. We talk about the Orioles pitching staff. We had this conversation right after the trade deadline, right? It was like, well, like who gets the ball game 1, right? And it looked like, it was like, oh, probably Tyler Wells, right? He's been lights out. He's got like a 3.2 ERA, lowest whip in baseball. And then he starts experiencing issues with fatigue. And so like I said, he's never thrown, more than, I don't think he's really ever thrown more than 100 innings in a professional season, in minors or majors, anything. And so then it was like, okay, well, we lost him, so he's probably not starting in the playoffs. It looks like they're going to move him to the bullpen, which is fine, right? And so now it just left this hole. And then Kyle Bradish emerges out of nowhere, right? Like we saw flashes of it last year, right? As the season ended, he ended the season last year like a 4.4 ERA, which isn't great, but he showed flashes at the end of last season that showed like this guy could be a good starting pitcher. And now this year he's put it together. So now it's Kyle Bradish, and now with Grayson putting it together, it's like, man, okay, now we have 2 arms that we can count on in the playoffs. And that's a heck of a lot better than a 1. If they didn't have Grayson and he was still trying to figure it out in the minors, or if Grayson had come back up and continued to struggle, even if it was, struggling less so than previously, even if he had a, 4.5 ERA now instead of the, ERA above 7 that he had before getting sent down, they can take so much. It just takes a lot off of everybody else, knowing that now we have 2 arms that we can count on going into the playoffs. And now you have 3, guys that you're looking at to start games 3 and 4. And now you're really only like battling a decision for 2 games versus 3 games or 4 games had, this not panned out. And so like the outlook for the playoffs is a lot better with Grayson throwing well.
It is, and I think also they're set up well because they're clearly heading towards a bye, so that helps them out too. Because what little pitching depth you still have in relation to some of the other playoff teams, you're not going to expend it in that first 3-game series. And another team that you're going to face will. So you'd hope that the pitching you have left over can beat the other teams, maybe 3 and 4 potentially in the early parts of that series. The Orioles get a lead, and that can get him through the ALDS. But I still have some questions about if it's going to be enough when you get into a 7-game series. Let's say they end up facing off against the Astros in the ALCS, or the Mariners with the pitching they have. but it's definitely a much, much better position than they were previously. I
Yeah.
think if we look at the Orioles moving forward, they could have made that move, right, where they trade the Hall to get Dylan Cease at the deadline. They didn't do that. Are they now looking better because it seems like there is a rotation that if you turn the page to next year, I would imagine you're maybe even more confident in the 2024 rotation than you even are in the 2023 playoff rotation.
Absolutely. And I laid it out in the article where they now have, if I'm not mistaken, I think it'd be like 6 guys that have made starts this year, looked all right, and I think like the biggest thing is you look at like Twins rotation, right? Everybody talks about how the Twins don't have an ace. The Twins are a bunch of guys that are like 2s and 3s on other teams. But when the guy you're throwing out, the guy in the back of your rotation, your 5th starter, it would be a 2 or a 3 on another team. It's like, okay, well, that's pretty good. Like, we don't have an ace, but we've got a lot of dudes who are solid. And the Orioles aren't there, but looking at it, it's like, man, they're kind of throwing out a lot of dudes that could be 3s on other teams. Like and so, when you look at the rotation next year, I imagine that if this year continues to go the way it looks like it's going to go, the rotation next year is going to look something like Kyle Bradish and Grayson at the top. And then you have John Means coming back from Tommy John, right? I think everybody forgets that, like John Means was a solid big league pitcher before going down with Tommy John. And so you have John Means coming back. He's probably the 3 next year. And then you throw Tyler Wells into the 4. As good as he looked this year, like if I'm assuming that Tyler Wells is going to come back next year and look like a similar version to what we saw this year, only hopefully able to throw, 140 innings next year, which would be excellent. And that's the guy, that's your 4 starter. And then the 5th spot is a fight between Dean Kramer and Cole Irvin. I think it should go to Cole Irvin. I think Cole Irvin has the better track record. He's a guy who, 2 years in a row in Oakland had, a low 4s. It was like a 4.1 and, a 4.02 in Oakland with 180 innings. Like I will take that with the 5 starter any day of the week, right? If the guy you're throwing out in the back of your rotation is capable of throwing 180 innings at a low 4s, and he's looked great in the 3 starts he's made, the 3 most recent starts that he's made since coming back. They've been weird with him. They sent him down, put him in the bullpen, let him make some starts. It's been weird, but it looks like he's back in the rotation, and his last 3 starts have been excellent. Right. In those 3 starts, he has like a 2.5 ERA, and he's pitching very, very well. And so if he continues to do that through the rest of the season, I think he's earned a spot in the rotation for next year. And like, this is a guy that you traded for, like you push some chips in and are like, okay, we think this guy can help us, so let him help you. Right. I get that he struggled earlier this year, but that's historically not who he's been. Historically, he's been a workhorse who's going to, he's not the best pitcher in the world, but he's going to give you a low 4s with 180 innings every year. And that's what he looks like. And so like, I feel a lot more confident in that rotation than, like I said, even I do in like in the playoff rotation, because I'm looking at the playoff rotation, and like I'm scared because, like you said, you have your reservations, right? My reservations are the fact that if they don't win those first 2 games, even in a 5-game series, when they throw G-Rod and Bradish out, then it's like, man, like, can we win if we get into like a boat race with, even like the Twins or the Mariners, whoever they end up matched up against, the Rangers? Like, if they get into a boat race with a team, and it's like they're throwing Kyle Gibson.
Yeah.
Like if you throw Kyle Gibson or Dean Kramer, like Dean Kramer, I'm telling you, this dude, I have no idea what he is going to do any night he goes out. This dude could give you 8 shutout with 6 strikeouts and like 2 walks and 3 hits. Or you throw him out there and he gets bounced in the 4th after giving up 6 runs. Like, it is wild. Like, you never, like, he is on either end of the spectrum every time he goes out. Like, I never know what I'm going to get. And then, and you know what you're going to get with Gibson, but it's like I said, if he, gets shelled a little, and all of a sudden you're down, 5-1 in the 6th, it's like, are you going to win that game against some of these other teams in the playoffs? And so that's where I get scared is like, if they take the first two, I think they'll find a way to win one of the games that Gibson or Kramer pitches. Like, that's just the way it'll go. They'll find a way to win one of those games, or, I like their chances in a game 5 with Kramer, or not Kramer, but with Bradish on the mound.
Yeah.
But it's just like, I don't know if they're getting in the boat races with teams, that's just not very sustainable. Even at and then Flaherty, right? Flaherty had one really good start, and since then has been incredibly mediocre, and not a guy that I necessarily trust throwing in a playoff game.
Yeah, no, I think it's a team that has a really bright future that I think can make a little bit of noise in the playoffs. It's hard for me to see them winning the World Series this year with the rotation that they have still, but they're in a much better place with the emergence of Bradish and G-Rod to at least get through a round, or maybe even 2. Who knows? We've seen crazier things than the Orioles, who've been an unbelievable team all year, finding their way into the World Series. And look, if they were to make it through the Astros, I mean, I don't know. You never know who's waiting for you on the other side. So, last year, no one would have saw the Phillies making the World Series. So I think that it could still be the Orioles' year. Moving forward, they certainly are in a better place. I would just hope still that they would find a little bit of money, trade some prospects, do something to get that one other guy this offseason. But for now, at least they're in a good position. And you know what? One more guy emerges, from that rotation, and or you go into next year and suddenly it's Bradish, Wells, and G-Rod are all awesome. And hey, maybe they don't need to do anything, and homegrown guys can take you there. But the Orioles are still in a much better place than the last time we talked about this a month ago.
Yeah, no, and that's the crazy thing. But like you said, I still do think that there is room to go and find someone. And it's frustrating, talk about the Orioles spending money, especially with all their recent comments via John Angelos. It's a little frustrating to think about. I mean, you have a guy saying that, we're probably not going to be able to lock up any of these young guys because we can't afford to spend that kind of money. And it's like, oh, you got to be kidding me. So now I've got to think about, Adley and Gunnar walking or being traded right at some point because the Orioles aren't going to pay them. And so, but I think there are guys out there, you look at the guys that are upcoming free agents, go get a Jordan Montgomery. What I mean? If Jordan Montgomery cost you $20 million a year, that to me is worth it. That's a dude. And when you're talking about dudes you can count on, right? And I think if you're the Orioles, right, you have to be looking at it man, I think they need an upgrade from Dean Kramer. I don't think Dean Kramer is a guy that you want starting every 5th day. And so I think you need to look for an upgrade for Dean Kramer. And I think a great person to be that upgrade would be somebody like Jordan Montgomery. Go get him, $20 million a year guy somewhere in there. I checked Spot Track, and I think they had him at 18, 19 million a year, something like that. But go spend 20 million a year on that guy, right? You spent basically 20 million a year. You basically spent $20 million this year on Frazier and Gibson. I would much rather have Jordan Montgomery than those two. Yeah. Or if they were to do the same thing, they go get a, middling, kind of, I don't want to say washed up. Washed up feels kind of mean, but a middling position player and a, veteran pitcher who, isn't all that great. I'd rather have Jordan Montgomery than two dudes like that. So there is a path to spending money in a smart way.
I feel like an interesting guy that I could see coming to Baltimore would be Marcus Stroman. And I think the reason why he could make sense is because I don't know how many teams are lining up for Stroman based on just being someone that could be a little bit more difficult to manage. But at the same time, he's someone that his market might not materialize to the point where, hey, you can get him on that 2 to 3 year deal. I think that the Orioles, when you brought up the comments by Angelos, the thing that's scary is it should be a really long window. And if you're not going to pay any of these guys, that window gets a lot shorter, where it might be a 5-year window, which is, hey, 5 years is awesome, but you want to win a World Series in those 5 years. So I hope that the Orioles do what they can to capitalize on it sooner rather than later, instead of just kind of saying, hey, we got a good team, come out to the ballpark and enjoy it while you can.
We will see. Maybe it's all just a bunch of smoke. I don't know. But the comments certainly aren't encouraging.
Not encouraging at all. But hey, G-Rod's performance has been. Make sure you check out Harrison's article and all the other great written stuff we have coming your way at justbaseball.com. Follow this Orioles team down the stretch here. We'll be covering more of it here at Who's Better. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe on YouTube. And again, like I said, check out everything at justbaseball.com.